the items as well.
Fair enough, sir. Dr. Menon, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Well, the 47th ASEAN Summit kicked off in Kuala Lumpur. Japan's new Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has attended the ASEAN Summit on a first foreign trip since taking office earlier this week. Takaichi met leaders of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to discuss regional cooperation. She focused on promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific and strengthening ties with ASEAN countries across technology, trade and supply chains. The Japanese leader also joined a Japan-led international conference on carbon neutrality and economic growth. She held bilateral talks with the Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who is the current ASEAN chair. Takaichi is scheduled to meet US President Donald Trump in Tokyo next week and will then travel to South Korea for the APEC leaders meeting. Let's listen into what the Japanese Prime Minister had to say.
It is an honor for me to meet you as leaders on my first foreign visit as Prime Minister of Japan. Japan and ASEAN have built a relationship as trusted partners with heart-to-heart connections through long-standing cooperation in a wide range of areas. Japan advocates for free and open Indo-Pacific and consistently support the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific.
Meanwhile, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi virtually addressed the ASEAN Summit, highlighting the theme inclusivity and sustainability. Prime Minister Modi announced 2026 as the year of ASEAN-India maritime cooperation and stressed growing collaboration in education, tourism, science, health, green energy and cybersecurity. He reaffirmed India's strong partnership with ASEAN, calling this the century of India and ASEAN countries, and expressed confidence in achieving ASEAN Community Vision 2045 and Viksit Bharat 2047. Let's listen in to what the Indian Prime Minister had to say.
इस वर्ष की आसियान समिट की थीम है इंक्लूसिविटी एंड सस्टेनेबिलिटी और ये थीम हमारे साझा प्रयासों में स्पष्ट दिखती है, चाहे वो डिजिटल इंक्लूजन हो या फिर मौजूदा वैश्विक चुनौतियों के बीच फूड सिक्योरिटी और रिजिलिएंट सप्लाई चेन सुनिश्चित करना। भारत इन प्राथमिकताओं का पूर्ण समर्थन करता है और इस दिशा में साथ आगे बढ़ने के लिए प्रतिबद्ध है। फ्रेंड्स, भारत हर आपदा में अपने आसियान मित्रों के साथ मजबूती से खड़ा रहा है।
All right, Ross Feingold, political analyst, is joining us from Taipei in Taiwan at this point in time. Ross, always a pleasure having you and speaking with you. Well, you know, for the most part, ASEAN has been a unit or a forum, which has been projected as a conglomeration and coming together of countries that have been ready to take on China for a number of reasons, which I'm sure, Ross, you're familiar with. Of course, the South China Sea and the, over masculine aggression in some parts of these ASEAN countries has also been an irritant. And for the first time, perhaps you and I can agree that cooperation, which talks about cybersecurity, which talks about trade, which talks about economy and people-to-people connection, is being celebrated here. Do you think that the momentum that the ASEAN countries had been carrying on for the last few years is shifting, so to speak?
The reality is any kind of momentum to cooperate on different issues, whether that's security and specifically the South China Sea, or on trade or other initiatives, it's often subject to changes in the political environment. And I don't necessarily mean the international or multilateral political environment, but the reality is that leadership in many of these countries has changed in recent years, sometimes rapidly. We're talking about the new Japanese Prime Minister's attendance at the ASEAN Summit, and then she'll be meeting with President Trump in Japan, and then she'll be going to APEC. But she's the 5th Prime Minister in 5 years. Thailand has changed its leadership multiple times in recent years. Malaysia has changed its leadership multiple times in recent years. Indonesia has a new president. The president of the Philippines is midway through his term, but he's limited by constitution to only one term. So it makes it difficult for there to be continuity. And that doesn't apply to all the countries in Southeast Asia, but it does apply to a number of them. And some of these leaders are looking at the other leaders and saying, well, I don't know if he or she is going to be around in a few years, so what's the point of making any commitments?
Ross, stay with us. In fact, the ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur continues with the leaders discussing regional cooperation, economic growth and security. US President Donald Trump has marked key highlights at the ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur. He met with Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, discussing trade relations and potential deals to benefit both countries. Brazil's foreign minister confirmed that the two leaders agreed to start a bilateral negotiation process, including discussions on tariff suspensions. On the sidelines of the summit, President Trump, in fact, presided over the signing of a ceasefire between Thailand and Cambodia. The agreement ends deadly border fighting that erupted in July, releases detained soldiers, and removes heavy weapons and landmines. Malaysian troops will monitor the border to ensure peace holds. Trump also signed trade deals with Thailand, Cambodia, and Malaysia, focusing on reducing trade barriers and boosting U.S. agricultural exports. This summit underscores renewed diplomacy and strategic engagement in Southeast Asia. Ross is still with us on the broadcast. Ross, of course, President Trump is making sure that foes turn into allies. There has been a considerable agreements that have been signed with Vietnam as well, and we all know the history between these two countries. Is this diplomatic outreach, or rather overreach, being done keeping the future in mind, or do you think this is business as usual?
That's a really interesting question, because on the one hand, there's a perception, and experts, scholars who look at Southeast Asia and its relations with the U.S., they often talk about how Southeast Asia struggles for attention from the United States government. And frankly, that's not a surprise given events over the past few decades. The U.S. has been heavily involved in the Middle East. There are other parts of the world that compete for attention, whether that's Ukraine or Africa or South America. But there's certainly a growing recognition of the reality that Southeast Asia is important, not only for competition with China, but also by itself. It's a large market. It's a market with a growing capability to export products to the United States, not just traditional industries, things like textiles or sneakers, but increasingly sophisticated products like semiconductors. And it's also an important market for U.S. investment. American companies are the leading investors in a number of Southeast Asian countries, and services exports like financial services or online services are also of growing importance for U.S. companies in Southeast Asia. But we could sign a bunch of trade agreements, and I'm speaking as an American. We could sign a bunch of agreements and have a nice summit, and it's great that President Trump is there in person. But what really is important is, what is the follow-up, and will there continue to be a high level of engagement going forward? Will the leaders of Southeast Asian countries be welcome to the White House, for example? Will President Trump make another trip in the remaining 3+ years of his presidency, or is this the one and only time he'll come to the region? There's important questions about follow-up.
All right, Ross, always a pleasure having you. Thank you so much. All right, well, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has